Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. Welcome again to Reinventing Transport. I'm your host, Paul Barter, in the middle of a thunderstorm in Singapore. And after a long break in which the world has changed dramatically since our last episode, we're going to Manila, and I'm talking with Robie Siy, who's a development economist and a sustainable mobility advocate. He's active in the Mobility Coalition, which is an alliance of 8 Metro Manila advocacy groups. He also writes a weekly column, Mobility Matters, for the Manila Times. Robie's employment history includes 5 years as an advisor to the Department of Transportation in the Philippines recently. And before that, he worked for more than 20 years with the Asian Development Bank. He has a PhD in City and Regional Planning from Cornell University. Welcome to the Reinventing Transport podcast, Robie.
Thank you, Paul. I'm really happy to be here.
We had some technical difficulties in getting ourselves organised, but now it's working perfectly, so I'm very happy about that. It's just the weather providing an extra soundtrack to give some ominous atmosphere for us in the background. What I thought we would do would be to start with a focus on how Metro Manila's transport is coping with this crisis, with this pandemic. But along the way, I also want to have various digressions and give the listeners an understanding of the wider context of Metro Manila and its urban transport. So we won't just be talking about this crisis, but of course it's on everybody's mind, and Metro Manila is actually a fascinating example of coping with this crisis or having some challenges with this crisis. So let's start with that. Could you maybe try to paint a picture of what's going on right now in Metro Manila? I understand you've got the so-called enhanced community quarantine. What does that mean for the people of the city and their livelihoods and their ability to move around?
Under enhanced community quarantine, we have quite a serious lockdown of most communities. What this means is that only essential workers are allowed to move around. So this would mean like skeleton forces of government institutions, law enforcement, health workers, and people who work in crucial industries like energy, water, and other things that need to keep running. If we look outside windows, there's almost zero public transport moving. There are some private vehicles, cars and motorcycles moving around, but to move around, you need to have some clearance from local authorities that gives you the right to go, to a neighborhood shop or to a bank to transact business, or you need to have some identification that you're an essential worker.
Right, so it's quite a strict lockdown.
And all public transport is actually halted except for a few hundred, maybe a couple of hundred buses that are providing some transportation for essential workers.
Wow. So to put that in perspective, normally there are thousands of jeepneys and buses, so just a few hundred is a really drastic limitation.
Yes, normally, I would say in Metro Manila, you have about 40,000 jeepneys running around, about 10 to 15,000 vans that run point to point, and about between 5 to 6,000 buses that are running around the city, both in intra-city and intercity. It's very quiet on that front now. And so what a lot of people have resorted to are long walks or are turning to bicycles. So the essential worker community, there's a huge demand now for bicycles that's largely unmet. So this is one of the things that's happening in the background.
And this is a city of more than 12 million people. If the Metro Manila itself is
Oh,
12
yes.
million, and then it spills over into neighboring provinces, right? So it's a large city.
That's correct.
So some of the trip distances can be quite long for some of these essential workers, right?
Definitely, definitely. Many have trips within 10 kilometers, but there are some people who actually have long commutes from outside provinces. And so nighttime population in Metro Manila could be about, 12 to 13 million. But during the day, normally pre-COVID, you would add another 2 to 3 million coming in.
Normally, this is not in any way a bicycle city, right? Bicycle use is extremely low prior to this crisis.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct, Paul. Bicycles always had a reputation of being very unsafe. There's almost no bicycle lanes around the city. Bicycles are not very much respected by motorists.
In normal circumstances, it's around maybe almost 70% of the motorized trips are by public transport and around 30% by private. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's roughly the breakdown from the more recent surveys. Although this is one thing, everyone sees cars, occupy every bit of road space. And so there's a sense that cars dominate the transportation scene. But the reality is that most of the people traveling are actually on public transport, 70%.
In some ways, Manila is a classic case of what I call a traffic saturated city. It's not a car dominated or an automobile dependent city. It's saturated with traffic because it's actually quite a high density place, isn't it? It's not quite as high density as Hong Kong. It's not a high rise city, but it's got tightly packed dense buildings, and I believe it's about double the urban density of Singapore, even though it's not a high-rise place. So there's just not much room for many cars. So even relatively modest car ownership can cause a huge mess, and it was causing a mess before this crisis. Roughly, what percentage of households do own a car?
Between 10 to 15% of households, and rising, because we have a situation where public transport is such low quality.
Is there any on-road priority for public transport in Manila?
Unfortunately not, Paul, although we've been campaigning for it. There's always the question of political will. The car-owning, segment of the population is very vocal and resists any measure to actually take more road space for public transportation. What I've been advocating is for our legislators and officials to champion the welfare of the majority, because the majority are those who do not own private motor vehicles.
I understand there are some bus lanes on some of the major roads, such as the enormous circumferential road known as EDSA. But you wouldn't categorize that as bus priority. There's an interesting story there. Could you talk about those bus lanes?
Yes, well, you see, these bus lanes on EDSA, I would say they are more a prison for buses. They are meant to imprison buses in road lanes. But unfortunately, because these two lanes are also on the curbside, you have all sorts of private motor vehicles mixing in with the buses. So these are not by any means exclusive lanes, because so many private motor vehicles want to access the curbside, want to turn right. So inevitably, that lane gets so much friction between private motor vehicles and buses.
Yeah.
You cannot categorize really those two lanes on EDSA as being exclusive lanes for buses.
We're sort of starting to build up a fairly sad story of the Philippines, and Manila is a fairly unequal society. Those who are wealthy, relatively wealthy, have cars and are privileged, and many of the policies prioritize them. Getting back to the bus lanes, that bus lane story is even more telling when you say it's a prison, because recently the authorities have been enforcing the rule that the buses must not stray outside of those bus lanes. I was shocked to read that.
Yes, that's correct, Paul. And I think that rule actually lengthened the travel time of so many bus commuters, bus users. Each trip ended up adding maybe another 20 to 30 minutes because all of a sudden you had, a lot more buses that were stuck there. And one thing I think we should talk about is also the business model of the public transport industry. I think that would also be interesting because it affects how those types of bus lanes, how they operate.
It's a can of worms, but regular listeners of Reinventing Transport will be a little bit familiar with the issues that we're about to dive into, because we've talked in several previous episodes about regulatory models for buses and minibuses like the Jeepneys. And so some of those issues will come up again. But Manila is a case where both the Jeepneys and most of the buses are under a rather unregulated or very, very lightly regulated model, right? Where each business is tiny, maybe owning just one or two or three Jeepneys or one or two or three buses. That model has some certain strengths, but it also has enormous challenges and weaknesses, doesn't it?
Yes.
For example, it means that the buses crowd into these corridors, like Ed said, and so actually the bus congestion problem is partly because of this regulatory problem, isn't it? It's not just that there's a limited space. Yeah.
Yes, I think on the plus side, the Philippine government has for years enjoyed the benefit of not having to pay for road-based public transport services because it's all been at the initiative of the private sector. And so jeepneys, buses, they all just rely on fare revenue in order to survive. And this means that the government has not had to pay for any of that bill. They, of course, finance railway development and railway operations and subsidize those to some extent.
Just let me interrupt for a moment. We should take a moment just briefly to give some context. So there are, if I understand correctly, 4 rail lines of varying capacities and operating. There's 2 so-called LRT lines, 1 MRT line, and the Philippine National Railways kind of a commuter line. And that sounds quite significant, but in fact it only really caters to about less than 10% of trips.
Yes, it's a rather small percentage of trips. The capacity of these rail lines remains fairly limited. The vast majority is really handled by road-based public transport, the jeepneys plus the buses.
And getting back to the current situation with the pandemic crisis, the fact that most of the crews who actually drive and operate buses and jeepneys, they are essentially self-employed, right? They rent their jeepney or their bus usually. Some of them own their own.
That's correct.
But what it means is that they're entirely dependent on fares, as you were saying just now, for their livelihood. And so right now, almost all of them are getting no income. It must be a great hardship for them.
That's correct. They're very difficult to regulate. They're very difficult to coordinate. And so this presents actually the biggest risk to resumption of public transport in Metro Manila, where you have now to implement a measure of physical distancing within vehicles, plus apply sanitary and hygienic measures such as disinfecting the vehicle. Of course, we can see the impact. You have reduced revenues on one hand, but increased operating costs because of the additional requirements for sanitation. And so if we just bring back private public transport in the same form or business model that we used to have, my view is that it introduces a huge health risk. And this is now a dilemma that the government is grappling with. we need to explore other options. And this is what we have been exploring and proposing over the last couple of weeks. What options do we have?
Yes, and so I understand the coalition. Was it called? Mobility Coalition.
Yes.
You have a proposal for quite a substantial change to the regulatory arrangements for jeepneys and buses, which would achieve several things. One of them is this health challenge that you're talking about just now. The other is the livelihoods of the drivers and the
Yes.
conductors.
Yes.
And the other is to make sure that the fares remain affordable, because if everything remains the same, then the operators would be forced to increase their fares.
Yes.
If they have to reduce their occupancy. So all of these things will be a huge challenge. But I wanted to ask you, this proposal, which is essentially to completely change the regulatory framework, and I'll get you to explain that in a minute as well. This is something that has been in the works for some time. That's been discussed over many decades, in fact, but it never happens. Do you think this crisis, in fact, is the opportunity, and in fact, it becomes necessary to make this change very quickly? So in the longer run, it might be a good thing and an opportunity, but the challenge right now is that we have this huge crisis.
Yeah, Paul, I think in the past, everyone saw the value of transforming the existing industry business model, but there were always large pockets of resistance, partly from the industry players themselves, because, why change? Why depart from this very good form of family business where it helps to pay for people's living expenses or retirement? It also helps to generate a lot of employment. There was all this built-in resistance. And of course, sometimes political will was in short supply, especially where you have an industry that had many, many people who were voters and who were electing, the legislators. But today, the big threat to the entire industry is that most of it may no longer be viable if we continue with the old business model. It would be unrealistic or unreasonable for the government to expect, the thousands of jeepney operators to actually comply with all these measures, knowing that they wouldn't have enough revenue to actually pay for even the disinfecting supplies. So it becomes really a huge challenge.
Could you explain the alternative model that you think might be feasible to put in place quite quickly?
What we would see, Paul, as necessary is to begin to contract public transport operators, and this contracting process in itself would bring about a consolidation. Within Metro Manila, we estimate that there are perhaps 10 to 12 corridors which are high volume and which we would call our mass transit corridors. And these could be the corridors where we would have trunk-type bus services, where you would have high frequency and regular intervals between the buses. And then from there, we could bring in feeder routes at the local government or individual city level. But what this all needs initially is a budget from government that will permit the Department of Transportation and city governments to contract for these services. And each contract, there could be one contract for one trunk line.
This would require quite a commitment from the national government of the budget. It would require the various existing drivers and conductors and owners of the vehicles all to agree to quite a different arrangement. Do you see any signs that they might be inclined to agree to a change like that?
Paul, it's a very difficult process because it's something so different from what people have experienced. But we know that these models are commonplace in many other cities with high-quality public transport. Now, on the government side, there of course are people who worry about the budgetary implications in the long term because there could be a risk that a continuing subsidy would be required. If government contracts for bus services, but perhaps the revenue might not be sufficient to cover the cost of the services. I think this is one big question. What we have been asserting is that public transportation and mobility is an essential service. Without that, it would be very difficult for the economy, the city, to function. So we need to actually put something in place that will be stable and sustainable. And if a subsidy is required, then so be it. Because, even though it's something that the Philippines has not had to shoulder in past years, it's also meant that the absence of that type of input has resulted in very low quality public transportation and very bad economic outcomes. Here we have a chance to bring in something to actually improve a lot of lives, improve efficiency, improve productivity. This is the argument that we've been making.
So what you're saying is certainly in line with some of the themes that in a previous episode with Colin Brader, we talked about the various pathways forward to bus improvements, and your suggestion is certainly in line with those. But one of the things that Colin emphasized was how challenging this can be and how it's often a step-by-step and slow process. So just a thought, I wonder if perhaps because it's such a crisis, maybe the need is to actually nationalize the whole industry as a temporary measure, and then gradually set up a more contract-based approach in a thoughtful way over the next few years. But the immediate nationalization could be quite quick. Maybe that's a silly idea. Maybe that's even more challenging. What do you think?
I think that's also possible. And but where I think there are also risks associated with that. If we nationalize the industry, the question always is whether the government has the competence and the resources to take on that challenge of organizing now the public transport services. I think what we have seen is that the Department of Transportation in the Philippines, it is actually a very lean organization with, in total, less than 600 staff covering airports, railways, ports, plus road-based public transport. So it's really a very thin capacity. And there are some operators who are larger firms with professional management and modern IT systems. And we would rely on these more professionally managed transport operators to be the core of the consortium that would now take on some of these contracts. They would have the capability, the management capability, to now operate the buses in a professional way. So this is how we hope that the transition could be made.
Does that include the Jeepneys as well?
It's an interesting question. What should happen to Jeepneys, Paul? And part of the problem with the Jeepneys is because the seats are very close to each other. The passengers face each other. Another point that I've been worried about is when you have now much lower capacity, it calls into question the long-term financial viability of low-capacity vehicles. And what I would see as a possible transition is that we get the jeepney operators to consolidate also and to transform into buses, because government is making available now loans for jeepney operators to modernize their vehicles. If they pool their borrowing power, 4 jeepney owners will have enough resources to borrow to buy a new bus. So we convert 40,000 jeepneys over the next 1 to 2 years into 10,000 buses, and would now join in the contracting process and would actually be able to sustain their operations and businesses much better than remaining as a small vehicle.
Yeah, these are such challenging issues, aren't they? And I see on various webinars and various sources, cities all over the world, rich, poor, middle income. The Philippines is a middle income country. Um, they're all grappling with similar issues, but the challenges vary significantly. And cities like Manila, where there's such a large informal mobility sector, it really is such a challenge on several levels, isn't it? It's a challenge for health going forward.
Yes,
It's a humanitarian challenge for the drivers and conductors.
yes.
One question related to that humanitarian challenge: roughly how many of the jeepneys are owned by their driver, and how many are owned by someone else, and the driver has a daily hiring arrangement?
I would say maybe a quarter of the jeepney population would have what they call owner operators and or owner drivers. The majority would be, owned by a person or a family and is rented out for a daily, lease cost. So that's the structure of how the jeepney business is run.
Maybe the family that owns a jeepney is reasonably well off and has other resources, and maybe they've lost some income at the moment, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
catastrophic for them. Then those owner operators are perhaps in the middle. They're not super poor. They had enough resources to buy a jeepney, but they've probably got loan repayments on their jeepney, and they're probably in quite a lot of stress at the moment, and some of them may be
Mm-hmm.
forced to try to sell their jeepneys right now. And I imagine it's hard to get a good price for a jeepney right now.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The third group would be these daily renters who have just totally lost their income right now and must be really struggling. Gosh.
It's a very difficult situation for the industry, for sure. What I can say also is that today everyone is desperate for solutions and desperate to find a new approach to staying viable in the industry. And I think we should take that as an opportunity to look for transformative solutions. For example, even in the bus industry, there's a lot of talk about moving now into consolidation and even running the bus services under a different business model so that we avoid all the problems associated with on-street competition. And I think that's really a very welcome development.
Let's move on, and maybe let's just finish with the prospects for bicycles. Of course, the pedestrian environment is another really huge topic, and the pedestrian environment in Manila has a lot of weaknesses. But that's a huge issue that, regardless, has to be tackled at some point. But the really interesting one in this crisis, which is a new issue, I guess, for Manila, in that before this crisis, it seemed more or less hopeless. There has been a bicycle advocacy community, but they haven't been making much progress over the years. But suddenly, is this the moment for bicycles in Manila, do you think?
Definitely, Paul. What I can see is that we will get to the point very quickly where the existing public transport capacity will not be there because of the physical distancing and because many operators will not be viable even if they wanted to go out. So this leaves many people and many who were former public transport users with no option but to walk or bicycle. And already in the last few weeks, the market for bicycles in the Philippines has actually mushroomed and, grown very fast. There's lots of people who are trying to access new or used bicycles because they figure that is how they plan to get around in the coming weeks. And in a way, it's a great opportunity. But at the same time, we have been advocating to our local government officials that they need now to create safe and spacious corridors for people to walk and cycle. This is what we have been pushing. how to do that in the short term and how to do that in the longer term.
Yes. Has there been interest from the authorities? Again, we started with a fairly gloomy perspective that the authorities were not very enthusiastic about public transport or bicycles. In this crisis, do you think they can be persuaded to act?
Yes, absolutely. I think that this is one thing that many mayors can do in order to improve the mobility within their own communities. And I think they very quickly will realize that many of their citizens and constituents, they won't be able to actually move around unless they will use something like a bicycle. And so there are a number of cities that have launched already into things like bicycle sharing programs, or bicycle lending programs. So there are a few groups that have started that. And I would say they're paying a lot of attention now to what other cities are practicing. So this is my big hope, that people will see that creating these spaces for walking and cycling will actually contribute to the mobility within a city and actually improve health as well as environment outcomes. I'm very optimistic about that.
And maybe that's a good place to end, actually, with that hopeful idea that out of a crisis some good may come. It's just too soon to know what will happen. Will the world be a different place next year, or will everything be going back to the way it was? We just don't know. It'll be interesting to listen back to this from in the future and listen to whether we were foolish or not. But thank you so much.
Absolutely, Paul.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for sharing your insights on Manila.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul.
Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion, or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.